you present here,
Afternoon.
as well as on Facebook. We appreciate your presence all around to begin what now has become our regular political education class, named after one of our greatest political educators, Jack Simon. And maybe it's appropriate, Comrade Jenny, that I say that yesterday began a program of the African National Congress of providing political education, facilitating the training of political educators on dialectical materialism. Jack Simon, wherever he is, he would be smiling with approval that we are carrying on in a variety of our alliance to continue the work that he taught many comrades after whom we are learning. So today is an important day too. I'm informed that it's National Garden Day. We were earlier just chatting about the province of Mpumalanga and the irony of the contrasting beauty of its environment, generally speaking, but the risks that it also has of pollution because of mining-related activities, especially coal and so on. And so that becomes an important part of what we are going to talk about today, water. The risks that are attendant with that is great one. The garden issue is critical one. I'm aware that many provinces has had a program, although government-driven, but in certain instances with communities on the ground themselves taking initiatives around creating gardening opportunities and so on. In the Free State, it was called Rdi Roadmap. We pride ourselves with gardens. And elsewhere, it was named in similar or different manner, that it is part of our great activity to value the relationship of water and what we grow, the food we eat that must be nutritious, and that the water that our gardens get to use, both with rain, but also other water that we are able to use must be such that it's free of pesticides and pollutants that risk the lives of many people. Today's theme is on water, and which is an element of our 3H campaign, human settlement, health, and hunger. The fight against the three so that they constitute an important part of the kind of conditions we need to create. South Africa is a water scarce country. So part of the overall problems that we are dealing with relates to drought, but also how we manage water as individuals, as communities, in neighborhoods, inside municipalities and in provinces, broadly speaking, throughout our country. The extent to which we can contribute ourselves as part of the work that needs to be done, consistent with our South African road to socialism, which one of chapters is about environmental regeneration and protection, is a critical one. So we are glad today to be going to listen to this again, who is a critical player, CEO of the Water Research Commission. And this is the second time he appears before a forum of the party, this time for political education purposes, and earlier to provide us with an interesting overview of the very subject he's going to be talking about. But maybe let me ask Comrade Jenny just to add a few points about who Comrade Disigan is, so that we can place him, broadly speaking, as an expert in the water-related stuff. It is always useful for those who may not know him to know him briefly, and then we will ask him to speak to us. Comrade Jenny, please do that for us. Just a few points, you know.
Thank you, Comrade Leach. Indeed, Comrade Desigan is an expert from the water sector, and I'm not sure that he would like this term, but a veteran in the water sector. His strength is both having been in the department, and so having the detailed knowledge of the challenges of water from within the public sector, as well as obviously now over the last chunk of time, and a sizable chunk of time, having been at the head of the Water Research Commission, which provides the knowledge support to the water sector, broadly speaking, has a very important role to play in the international arena. So you will hear as Comrade Desigan speaks that he's drawing on that international knowledge and international contribution that he and his institution have played in the global water environment. But apart from the public service experience and the knowledge sector experience, Comrade Desigan is also an activist committed to the transformation of society, and the transformation in particular of water as an enabling dimension of both the economic environment as well as the human and social environment, as well as obviously the climate environment. So we are really excited to have formed this partnership with Comrade Desigan around sharing knowledge about the water sector. And I hope that fulfills what you got. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Comrade Jenny. And now we are glad to invite Comrade Desigan to speak to us. I don't have to state, and Comrade Desigan is aware that water, as I said earlier, is a component of what this year is our Red October component. It's an important campaign function over which we are going to be focusing our energies from this year to next October, but on an ongoing basis. We've just highlighted it as part of our campaign. So what he's going to say to us is promptly, immediately, absolutely relevant, not just to broaden our appreciation of the dynamics around the water issue, but also as a component of our own campaign work to change the quality of its management, politically, broadly speaking, but also inside our communities and as individuals. Thank you very much, Comrade Desigan. Please talk to us.
Thank you, Comrade Lechisa. Thank you, Comrade Jenny, for that introduction. And good afternoon to all of you on a wonderfully rainy day in the Highveld. Rain makes water people very happy. I can also tell you that we've completed the first line of the analysis around the new season, and it appears that we are moving from, you will all know, the El Nino that gave us grief over a period of 5 years of sequential drought years. We are moving into a La Nina cycle, which is a wet cycle, which means we're going to have more rain. It also means our infrastructure is really going to be tested. But colleagues, I accepted the invitation to share with you some notes around water and the importance of water. And I'm going to do that right now. For those colleagues that actually have been part of the consultative conference, some of these slides are going to look very familiar. And there are a lot of slides, let me warn you in advance, but I am going to go quite quickly through some of them. I just thought it would be better to have extra slides so this presentation can be used as a resource document as people want to. So our country's water challenges in general have knowledge around drought. The most recent, of course, has been our focus on COVID-19. And COVID-19 has really sharpened the blade in some issues. It has certainly organized itself as a magnifying glass to examine our systems and the robustness of our systems. And I think it is fair to say that for South Africa, on the COVID front, we have done better than many, many places in the world. But the warnings are very clear. like Europe is now in some places in its second wave, in other places in its third wave. We are going to have to be very wary around this. I just want to point out that the South African situation is fairly unique in our part of the world. And I think it's important to note this because Africa in general is managing to avoid this crisis. There are many interesting theories associated with this, but I think we have to also say that the robustness of the response in some parts of Africa to this has been good. Things like the vaccination campaigns have certainly played a part, and hopefully Africa as a whole would have organized itself to be beyond this crisis. But I wanted to say that as part of the introduction to this, that the story that we have around the entire 3H campaign, around water, around issues of the environment, there's a lovely chat going on in the chat line around urban forests, for example, actually organizes itself in 2020 on a nexus of catastrophe. The COVID-19 is the obvious one, and it's the one that we cannot ignore in any conversation. But it is also masking. It is masking around a much broader and much deeper climate crisis that we have in the world. Climate change is an issue that we are not dealing with sufficiently strongly in the world. And the disbenefit of that is going to be very apparent everywhere in the world, but most particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the best long-term scenarios that we have looked at around the impact of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa says that we are going to be in a +4 degree scenario. So just imagine this. The hottest day that you have ever experienced in South Africa, add 4 degrees to that. Add 4 degrees to the average, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about drier and wetter. It is quite extreme. Then there's the issue of the economic constraints. I know several comrades here are also part of governments, and you will be having this discussion quite intently, that even before COVID hit these shores, we had 3 successive quarters of contraction. The first quarter inside the COVID organized for us to have 12 consecutive months of contraction. It is unlikely that the second quarter result is going to be any different. And this is what we are sitting with as a problem in South Africa, as a problem generally in Africa, and as a problem definitely in a very serious way all around the world. Ms. Gopinath, the chief financial officer of the IMF, put out a set of IMF predictions around these issues. And frankly, it looks pretty dismal for most of the world. So this is not something we should ignore, but like any other economic crisis, depending on how you respond to it, you could organize to seriously change the nature of the global gain by the way you react. And then alongside this is the issue of multilateralism and a very broken multilateralism, in particular around issues of the trade wars. And I think in the discussion time, we should draw the connections between this and what it means for things like water security and the servicing of the indigent in particular. On the water matters, this is something I know you will know very well, not only from the last discussion, but because this has been of intense discussion as a public dialogue, as a parliamentary dialogue, as a dialogue inside the executive of government, as a dialogue in the private sector, at least since 2014 recently. We are coming out of the most impactful El Nino event in 100 years. And let us not forget that. And our pattern of use is slightly different from the rest of Africa, certainly different from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, but we are not immune from the negative impacts of this. The second thing that we need to note is that our river system, as proud as we are about our river system, is actually in global terms not a very extensive river system. Our average flows in this country are very, very low. We have some decent rivers, the Orange and the Vaal are 2 of those. But in general, even in the perennially flowing rivers, our average flows are very low. And you will see it from this graph. If you took low, moderately low, and very low, and you will see that this dominates the landscape of our surfaces. And then if we move to the other domain, around how we use water in South Africa, we are a little bit different from the world average. We use less water in agriculture than other places do. And in part, this is really good. It shows some of the efficiencies that we have in some of the system around our agriculture. But we use an enormous amount of money in the municipal domain compared to the world average. And this is something that we have to deal with, because the numbers on the right of your screen tell you a very interesting story. It says that the world average on liters per capita per day, that is the amount of water used by a country divided by the number of people in it, it's not an individual use, is 175 liters per person per day. South Africa is the 30th driest country in the world. In fact, if we add in the last 6 years around the drought, I think we have dropped 2 places on that index. This 30th driest country in the world, in the lowest 15% of water availability, actually uses 235 liters per person per day. It says that we are wasteful, and this is something that we have to engage, and we have to engage robustly. Now, if we look at the predictions going to 2035, and we've done this work very deliberately with non-water people because of our own biases. So this involves futurists in the University of Denver and a risk-based approach from the point of security with the Institute of Security Studies. And these are the scenarios that we have come up with. And the scenario is saying to us that even if every single one of the current supply projects that we have in the plan, in the Water Master Plan, is actually realized, if we continue to use water in the wasteful way that we have been doing to date, we will in fact have a deficit in 2035 of 1.1 billion cubic meters. 1.1 billion cubic meters is what the whole state of Singapore uses. That's the kind of losses that we are talking about. That's the kind of deficit that we are talking about. But I want to point out something very, very important, that this is not actual consumption on the 235, because the 235 liters per person per day includes the now 37 to 41% non-revenue water that we have in our municipal systems. This is the difference between accounting with what goes out and what is received back in terms of revenue, including the 25% of actual loss, leaks inside the piping system. And this is quite extreme, and this is something that we have to engage quite robustly. Then we move on to SDGs and the SDG progress report. And this comes from the voluntary report that South Africa supplied to the United Nations. It's supplied this in 2019, and it's a combination of data from 2018 where we had it and 2017 where we didn't have it. And this is our story. We've gone from a safe drinking water access of close to 95% 5 years after democracy in 1999. We are now at 80%. Now, we did remarkably well. In 1994, we had a 58% access. And using a human rights-based approach to access to water in those first 5 years with a very intense program around free basic water, we got to the 90% mark. We've managed to retain this in the urban domain, but just have a look at what it's saying in the rural domain, that we are in serious trouble. On safe sanitation, in spite of heavy investments in things like the bucket eradication program, we are sitting in 2019, and the 2020 numbers will be very similar, of 70% on safe sanitation. That's a 30% deficit. It is quite intense, and this is something we should engage quite robustly. On the issue of water quality, we know this is a problem. This is a problem for many, many reasons. One of the reasons is that there are many more of us now than there were before, and our water intensive activity, including industrial activity, has gone up. The net result is that we have a very polluted system. A natural system, I mean, we were talking about Mpumalanga in the earlier discussion, perhaps the best agricultural land that we have in this country, perhaps the best agricultural land south of the Great Lakes region in the world, but it has been completely destroyed in parts around the coal mining activity, around power generation. And we know we talk about acid mine water in Gauteng, and Gauteng is a big focus around the 3 basins, but the most acidic water that we have in the country is actually in Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal, the northern part of KwaZulu-Natal, on the back of the mining activity. So our 52% is something that we have to work on. On water efficiency, well, I told you, we're sitting now around this new number of 40% for non-revenue water. The previous number that we did in the quite intensive survey in 2011 had that number at 36.7. It's actually gotten a little bit worse. One of the things we have been good at compared to most of the world is an integrated approach to water resource management, and we're at 71%. But I think it's fair to say our ecosystem health is in serious trouble. But politically, we have to engage something else. The reality is that the transformation of the water sector in this country, as I said in the previous discussion, is probably less than 10%. We sit in a country 26 years after the dawn of our democracy, with 95% of the allocatable water still sitting in the hands of the people who had that access before. It is on the back of respecting what was called existing lawful use of water, but it also marks a failure to fully implement the licensing system in a robust way that would take us into a completely different space. And I'd like to peg this, Chair, as one of the things that we should talk about in the discussion time. So let's begin with some thoughts around the political actions. The first thing I want to point out is how new all of this is in our part of the world. What we see on the left-hand side of the screen is this continent as it was demarcated in 1914. And what you see there is the direct result of a rapid implementation of the Berlin Conference of 1883. And what you see there is an Africa with no African countries. It's an Africa as an extension of primarily its European owners and under trusteeship. It's an incredible story. We all know the South African story and the intensity of the South African story. And this organizes itself in a way that forces us to engage something really important. When Antonio Guterres did the Mandela lecture this year, he talked about the inequality pandemic as being perhaps the biggest risk to the world currently. And this is a message that he and several others have been repeating fairly frequently since then, and talking about the need for a new social compact for this new era. The world has never been this unequal. South Africa as a country currently has a Lorenz curve that is a little bit worse than it was under apartheid. This is amazing because it now has a new bulge in the middle around the disappearing middle class. And COVID has not helped this situation in any significant way. Now, there's been a global response to this, and there are new NGOs, and one that I'm very proudly associated with is called the Human Right to Water, is tackling this at a global level as we need to tackle it at a local level. We also should remind ourselves of our own pedigree. South Africa, in 1998, with the National Water Law, and even before that in the Constitution, was the first country in the world that formally adopted the notion of the human right to water and sanitation. It took the UN system until 2010 before the global system acknowledged this. We were way, way ahead of that curve. And it was on the back of the remarkable efforts of Professor Kara Rasmal and the Mandela cabinet as a whole, actually, that organized for us to have a pioneering space in the world. So much so that he was the Stockholm Water Prize laureate in 2002 on behalf of South Africa for that effort. So we have had a very powerful start in this domain. Somewhere along the line, life caught up with South Africa, and we have lost some of our leadership in this domain. And this is something that we have to robustly re-engage. Now, we have shown that we can be quite robust. And during the COVID crisis, when the hand washing campaign became one of the primary measures around dealing with the spread of the infections of the virus, we were right there in the middle of it. There was a massive investment very quickly with the Water Command Center around organizing for access to water for people with the Tanks and Tankers campaign. And yes, indeed, some of it will have been a sunk cost in the form of the tankers, but the tanks become part of the local water security in many of our systems, in particular municipalities. So this is something again. So we've shown that politically we can lead. We've shown that in practice, when we are squeezed sufficiently, it is possible for us to pull our socks up and get in the right direction. And Minister Sisulu led that campaign. So we need to move into this thick and fast. The other issue that I want to emphasize in this is the issue of affordability. Now, affordability perspectives are often lost in the discussion around the price of water. Price of water as a demand management tool, yes, it works very well. But we have to really work out what the affordability perspective is when we look at issues like tariffing. So we have to look at what is the established commercial. We have to look at what the domestic use and the affordability of domestic use. We also have to look at two sectors that we don't usually look. One is the emerging commercial players, including commercial agriculture, the new agriculturalists. And then it's the issue of the unserviced. The unserviced pay the most for water in any system. They pay it by loss of opportunity for economic activity because they have to go and fetch the water. They lose the opportunity for schooling. Some pay because their lives are threatened. Some pay with their dignity. It's an enormous place. So the globe as a whole has recognized this problem as well. And one of the things it has engaged fairly robustly is this issue of the acceleration framework around SDG 6 and the decade of action. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Apart from saying that another South African first that I should herald, also from a Stockholm Water Prize laureate, is John Briscoe, who spent most of his time working in the World Bank around the implementation of that very piece of legislation that we are so proud of, the 1998 National Water Act. Interestingly enough, most of the project that he has worked on has been around everywhere in the world except South Africa. And this is something we have to engage. But the thing I want to spend the next couple of minutes on is innovation. So we need political action, absolutely. We need action around advocacy in that domain, but we also need to organize for an innovation revolution, because the only way we are going to organize to sustainably get services to all the people in this country, and South Africa also has a historical international responsibility around playing a major part in doing this all over the world, is on the back of innovation. And in this domain, I just want to emphasize a few things. The first is that Africa as a global laboratory for integrated water resource management is absolute. We are organizing many leapfrogs, the kind of leapfrogs that we have already seen, for example, in mobile telephony, is mirrored now in certain aspects of water, around access to water with M-Pesa mechanisms, for example, in Kenya, around non-sewage sanitation, and I'm going to talk about that just a little bit just now. And there are new possibilities around the way we treat wastewater that organizes for Africa to actually visualize for the world what 21st century water management can be about. Because part of the problem that we face in the world is that we are trying to solve a 21st century problem in water and sanitation, in energy, in climate, with 20th century technology, and in many cases, 19th century operating rules. This is something that we have to engage very, very robustly. So in this domain, around the 10-year water vision, we have something called the Water Rdi Roadmap, which tells you exactly how we can go through this. This is now embedded in the water and sanitation master plan as well. But the thing I really want to do is to emphasize some examples. So one of the things that we have to engage is that how come when we are sitting with some of the best technologies already proven in our laboratories here in this country and in the laboratories of many of our partners around the world, why is this not getting into action? Now, one of the things that has been raised is the regulatory environment. And this is an example of where you can get quite innovative about that. Many of the countries tried to get this into their national standards without much success. So a bunch of countries got together. Eventually, it started off with 5 countries, South Africa being one of the leads. Eventually ended up with 120 countries that organized to develop an international standard. So we have ISO 3500. And I'm very pleased to tell you that the first 2 countries that implemented this as a national standard in the world has been on this continent. First Senegal, and a couple of months later, South Africa. And this represents possibly right now the only way we're going to get to meet our SDGs in sanitation by 2030. But it goes beyond that, because it can be done in a way that organizes for us to do much more interesting things. Some of this has been expressed in the Industrial Policy Action Plan, and we were very happy in the last discussion to have Rob Davies with us. He, in fact, when he was Minister of Trade and Industry, launched this plan. And in his launch, he spoke a little bit about this particular chapter and what it actually meant, because what it organizes itself to do is that this industrialization of water, and I'm not saying privatization of water, that's quite different. This industrialization of water around developing these technologies and manufacturing them locally have the opportunity for economic transformation. It has the opportunity for the new enterprises that we want to see, and it has the opportunity for jobs and livelihoods that we so desperately need. So I've put together a couple of case studies. I'm not going to talk to all of them because I want to save some time for the discussion, but Jenny will make sure that everyone gets the presentation so you can go through some of the detail that talks to this issue operating at very different levels. Because what the IPAP spoke about, a very formal industrialization model. And it has its place, and we are pushing very hard for this to occur. We've been engaging a lot and got a lot of encouragement, I must say, from Sputta Damagopa at the Presidential Infrastructure Investment Office. And we're hoping to make that work. But it's not restricted to that domain. So these examples that I'm putting out now are what can happen at a very local level, starting from an almost zero base. So the first of those is something called multi-use systems for water, because the old way of doing water is to have dedicated infrastructure for one purpose only. And this is an example of where we took a couple of communities in Limpopo, and you can see those, and I'm sure you will recognize those places. The center has been Shakuma, primarily because the matriarch that drove this program, Ma Florence, is from there, but she actually has organized her influence in the entire domain. And we actually ran simultaneously the case studies in a number of these locations. And the basic idea, and you can go through the detail, was to organize for an access point for water. For Shakuma, it was a mountain stream. And then organizing for the community themselves to be taught on how to build the infrastructure, but first to design it themselves, and then to build that, physically build that infrastructure for multiple use, for personal water use, for some agricultural use, for some commercial use, and very interestingly, the community themselves demanded that the environmental share is kept intact for their sustainability. And these pictures is some of the work that has happened during that project. These are some of the findings. The first of which says that the self-supply system on the multi-use systems is actually very, very vibrant, very, very intact. And these folk have really taught the people who went. Eventually, the scientists became the documenters of the project rather than leading the project themselves. This was quite remarkable. The impact has been stupendous. You know, we've done all the right kind of measurements in the right kind of places, and I'll show you some graphs just now. But pictures like this really tell you the story, that a dry patch that used to be there in the previous season is now vibrantly growing vegetables, not just vegetables for subsistence use inside the village, but also for commercial use. And this has been quite remarkable. And these are some pictures from some of the other places that were involved. And here is the story, that 71 to 100% of the households in every one of these sites are now on multi-use systems approach around how they access their water. It is absolutely incredible. And in 4 out of the 6 villages, we now have 100% self-supply operating based on what people were able to do themselves. If we look at how we're able to organize for water security, what we're seeing here is the vast improvement with the addition of local storage, like the JoJo tanks. And this is for the long term inside the system. Here you can see what the yields are on those crops. And we're not talking only of low value crops here. We're now talking about high value crops like avocados and like mangoes and like bananas. This is quite incredible. And the comparison between the 2018 year, which was in the middle of the project, close to the baseline, but in the middle of the project, and 2019, where we were seeing the fruits of this labor, we saw a year-on-year increase of 65%. This is really, really remarkable. And then this tells you about who's in charge, and that is fantastic. But here's the thing. We also saw an incredible improvement in water quality. You know, the primary aim of this was to organize for access to water, but in the way the folk designed the projects themselves, they've organized to increase the water quality inside the system in a totally remarkable way. And the graph at the bottom tells you about how much time has been saved around the activity of going to fetch water then and now. So the blue lines you see are the 2018 lines, and the orange lines are the 2019 lines. It's a fantastic story. It is something that can be replicated in many, many places. And we are currently in discussion with the African Development Bank, which was one of our key partners, around actually replicating this, not only all over this country, but all over this continent. The second one, and I want to take 2 or 3 minutes on this, is a social franchising model. So the problem that we were engaging here is that we were able to put up sanitation facilities in many of the places. This is the Eastern Cape now. And we were targeting schools in particular. The problem is that the maintenance of those toilets, organized for those toilets not to really be available for use after 6 months. And so we decided to organize ourselves around some very innovative thinking around how you can organize to create businesses inside these communities from a zero start, and I must emphasize that, from a zero start, to be able to organize to provide these maintenance services for those toilets, and thereby have a toilet facility available in each of those schools. I am happy to tell you that this franchising model, the franchising model means a central support system that gives you the formula around each of these things and how they're done, and training on how it should be done, and then supporting the beneficiation activities. Because in addition to organizing for these companies, because they're now companies which employ many people, to get a primary source of income from the maintenance of the system, we also organize for them to be able to use the waste from that system in the form of biochar and other available beneficiation opportunities to expand those businesses. And it has been a truly remarkable story. It's a story that has actually now won international awards and has really put us as South Africa in the center of a global conversation of how we can really organize to supply services in a way that organizes for the entrepreneurship and the development of companies, which in turn will create jobs for people, which then will organize for the economic inclusivity that we all want to see. So these are the places where it has happened already, and hopefully in time, there'll be many circles all over this country. We would really like to see that. These are some of the people involved. I have to also point out that 80% of the companies were women-led and are women-owned, and over 400 schools are currently on these schemes in the Eastern Cape. And we have also expanded it to further parts of the community. The net result is moving from that kind of toilet experience to the one on the right. So this is a really exciting thing. And this is something that is available for us to do in many, many places. Then the next example, which I'm not going to talk about a lot because the slides will take care of that, is organizing for empowering people to be active in agriculture. And Amanzi for Food in South Africa has become a project that has many partners. Our primary partner is Rhodes University, but there are many other universities that have now joined this to be able to do this in various other parts of the country. We developed the material. We developed a training program for the trainers. The trainers in turn get into the system, and we are seeing some fairly remarkable results. And the basic idea is that this triangle around research and education and extension is now very vibrant, and each part of that triangle is empowering the others. And these are some pictures of not only the people, but some of the products that are coming out of the system. And the thing that I want to emphasize, and this goes into the next case study, is that the way we're talking to people has changed very radically. We're now talking about using the mobile devices, using the internet, using social media as a primary means of empowering people, of training people, of building capacity. And what we have seen in these examples is an absolutely remarkable result. So the last case study that I just want to point to before I wrap up is around school gardens. And today being Garden Day, we shouldn't only be thinking about our gardens, we should be thinking about what we can do to organize for people to be in a completely different space around the environment and around nutritional security. What we have experimented with together with partners in the Agricultural Research Council, let me please acknowledge them, is to enhance feeding schemes rather by organizing to have school food gardens. And these school food gardens have been remarkable successes. The closest to me and the one that the WRC has adopted as part of its CSR program are two schools in Mamelodi. And these two schools in Mamelodi are not only growing enough food for their own use, they are organized sufficiently to, on a weekly basis, provide food packs to other members of the community as well. And then dealing with issues that around the peri-urban environment in a smart way. So one of the very big issues in the peri-urban environment, of course, is the availability of land to grow. Well, we have developed this, and this is something that, well, we've done a little bit extra to what people would normally do to make this work, but this is a remarkably easy way. With somebody that has 1 square meter space, you have 1 square meter to actually grow vegetables or fruit in a vertical direction. And we have shown how this can work, and it works extraordinarily well with the bag system. You can, of course, get much more sophisticated around it. So we're sitting in the space of not only organizing for the possibility of people being at another level of the game, but with the way we've organized the teams that actually manage these gardens in these schools, and these are teams from the local community, all of them, almost without exception, have taken the same concepts, have applied it in their own homes, and are now organizing to ask the municipality for further space that they can use in other unused spaces for them to actually continue with this food gardening program. Nutritional security is something that is paramount, and it's something on the back of the water intervention is possible to get right in a serious way. Then to wrap up, colleagues, we just have to organize ourselves to think about this with a new social tapestry. And here I borrowed from the third of the 4 Stockholm Water Prize laureates today, and this is Rajendra Singh from India, who started off life as a doctor and went to work in a village and discovered that the bigger problem that the villagers had was actually access to water, that they had access to clean and usable water and safe sanitation. Many of their ailments would actually disappear. And he has become known as the waterman of India, and he has taken this concept from village to village to village, now globally. And we must do much the same. And the MUS project is an example of how we can make this happen. The picture in the middle, the person on the right is Ma Flo, who is the matriarch of the MUS project in Limpopo, and has already been asked by the African Development Bank to be one of their ambassadors for the Africa-wide project. And the person that she is next to is Wambi Guchuri, who is one of the executives of the African Development Bank, who said that the story of Ma Flo, her own story. She is from Kenya. She grew up in such an environment. And it is, in fact, the story of 90% of this continent. And we're hoping that this will grow in leaps and bounds. And then the last person that I want to acknowledge, and our most recent laureate from last year, is Jackie King. Jackie King is known globally now as the mother of environmental river flows. She was pivotal to the development of those components of the South African water law around the environmental rights to water. And this is a core part of our sustainability program going into the future. All of our interventions have to be organized that we have water today, water tomorrow, and most importantly, water for the next generations that come after us. So colleagues, on that note, I want to stop and I look forward to the discussion. I just want to point out there is a ton of information available to you free of charge on the WRC website. You just have to go into Hub and it's yours. And each of these documents have the names and contact details of the person inside the WRC you can talk to if you want more information around those projects. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, again. This is absolutely fascinating and interesting. Comrades, wherever you are, especially those who come from provinces in which